Hello and welcome to the DVB Newsroom. I'm English news host Nora. Joining me today is Thin Lei Win, an award-winning Myanmar journalist and the co-founder of the Kite Tales, a Myanmar multimedia storytelling project. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Throughout your career in the media, you have specialized in the intersection of food, climate change, and humanitarian issues in Myanmar. What is it about this unique blend of reporting that makes you want to write these stories?
I don't actually see those three as separate beats. And I think, to be perfectly honest, my experience being born and raised in Myanmar really shaped how I cover food and climate change issues globally, right? Because if you look at it in many ways, Myanmar is still an agrarian country, right? And I don't know if you will remember, but at least when I was growing up, I remember seeing all these big posters everywhere in Yangon and in other parts of Myanmar as well, praising farmers as our savior because they produce the rice and, the other foods that we're eating, that nourish us. But of course, as I grow older, I also realize that farmers, in Myanmar are some of the poorest people in the country, both in terms of cash and also in terms of their diets. So of course, that made me ask, well, why is that the case? Why is the propaganda and the reality so different? So that helped me sort of understand things beyond what is being said, in public. And also, before the coup, Myanmar was a poor country, but we were a food surplus country for many, many years. And what do I mean by that? That means we produce at least enough staples, so that's rice, pulses, grains. We produce enough of them to actually sell to others. But if you actually look at, hunger and nutrition or malnutrition levels in Myanmar, there are many pockets, particularly in ethnic minority areas, just take Chin or Rakhine as an example, where the hunger and malnutrition levels are really, really high. So that again begs the question, how is it that we produce more than we can consume, at least in terms of staples, but there are so many people who couldn't who couldn't feed themselves. And of course, if you look at climate change, Myanmar has a very, very long coastline, and that's very vulnerable to, monsoon and cyclones. We've seen it with Cyclone Nargis. We've seen it repeatedly, particularly on the coast in Rakhine, right, with the storms. And then, of course, we have a very dry center, the central dry zone, which is where we grow pulses and beans. And there, the temperature shifts, increase in temperature are really, really affecting farmers because, any little deviation in terms of rainfall or temperature has an impact on what we can grow. And then since the coup, and even before the coup, right, with the military strategy on four cuts, the PLA, we have seen how successive military governments have used food as a weapon to try and, oppress and control communities, not just, armed groups that they're fighting, but also ordinary villagers. And you could see how conflict and climate change is really having an impact on Myanmar. And now we have, millions of people who are unable to feed themselves. So growing up in Myanmar and seeing all of that has really shaped my reporting and understand that humanitarian crises, regardless of where they happen, they're almost never just about a lack of resources. It is a political decision and a political failure of, whoever is in power to make sure that the people are protected and well fed. And I find that, fascinating. And like I said, I see all three as interconnected, and that's how it has shaped my reporting.
Many international stories on Myanmar focuses on generals, armed groups, and politics, but your work starts from people's daily lives. Why is that important?
So, when I first started this project on the kite tails, one of the essentially the founder of Bansodan Gallery, U Aun, said something that has stayed with me, and he said, the real history lies among the people. And I think that is so true because, like you said, a lot of reporting on Myanmar, whether it is official or from international media outlets or from the government mouthpiece, has very much focused on the people in power, not the actual people who have lived through, decades of military rule, the British occupation, the Japanese occupation, and then, a brief opening. And I think that's where we find the real story and the real history. And there's another quote, this one by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a famous author, who talked about the dangers of a single story. And I always think about it whenever I talk about Myanmar, because like you said, a lot of stories in Myanmar have very much focused on just the generals or the people in power. And I think it is incomplete because Myanmar is such a diverse country, full of fascinating people and groups and languages and religions and experiences. And I think focusing only on a single group of people or a single layer of people, it's not doing the country justice.
Before the 2015 elections in Myanmar, you and fellow journalist Lei Win founded Myanmar Now, an investigative news agency. How did it feel at the time?
Those were the good days, right? I mean, we were so full of hope and optimism that we had a bright future ahead of us. I mean, I voted for the first time in my life in the 2015 elections, right? Because I was too young to vote in the 1990 elections. And I was already a journalist in 2010, and I was trying to, I guess, stay under the radar. So decided not to vote. So that was the first time I was able to vote in Yangon, in my hometown. Obviously, we were not naive, right? I mean, Gosu Win's a former political prisoner. We didn't think that things would change overnight, but we thought that we were on our way for a brighter future, not just for us, but for the future generation as well. Unfortunately, we've been proven just a decade on that that's not the case.
You also co-founded the Kite Tales as a storytelling platform in 2016. This was after Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy was elected. What did you intend to achieve with it, and how has it grown since?
So I guess there were two main things. One was what was happening at that time, which was that everybody was so optimistic, like I said, hopeful, and they all wanted to look forward and not backwards. Like history is seen as something, I guess, maybe in some ways a bit inconvenient, but also difficult, right? Because we had a difficult history with the 1988 protests or the Saffron Revolution or the military's response to, the Cyclone Nagis, but even going further since the 1960s. So we felt like we wanted to capture people's memories in this transition time, people who still remember the past, but are looking forward to the future. So, that was one reason about that particular point in time. The other reason was that when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, I remember very distinctly, going through history lessons and history books at high school, and they were all about mythical kings and heroes, from the Burmese history, the British occupation, the Japanese occupation, and then Une Win took over. And then it's almost as if the history stopped after 1962, in our textbooks. It's almost like, yes, because of instability, Une Win took over, and now here we are. There was never really anything about what ordinary people were going through, how they felt, what they were doing. So I really wanted to document the lives of ordinary people, who never were given a voice about what was it like for them. So it was about capturing, both the present and the past.
How do you decide whose stories need to be recorded?
So It very much tends to be, either planned or serendipitous. We will plan some of those, encounters. So, for example, we once decided to do a trip to Koreni and Shan together. And before we went, we contacted Gopascal Kudwe, the author of From the Land of Green Coast, because he is, from Pekong region, and he knows people. So we're like, do you suggest anybody that we could talk to? And so he was like, oh, okay, I'll introduce you to a couple of people, that are interesting, had interesting life experiences. But then when we got there and we met those people, while we were there and he was there too, he was invited, without any plan, to attend a traditional housewarming ceremony in the rural area. And he just said, do you want to come along? And we were like, yes, of course. So we followed him. And then we did a video and we took pictures and then we wrote about that housewarming ceremony and we interviewed the lady whose house, it was. And then also, while we were in Loiko, we were having lunch at a pet toad place. I guess which is a traditional steam sort of like dumpling with spring onions. And it was so delicious. And it's supposed to be one of the most famous pet toad places in Loiko. So we ended up going to the proprietor and asking, this is delicious. Can we come and film you, make it and then interview you about your shop? And she was like, yes, sure, of course. So, there were a lot of encounters that were, like I said, they were pre-planned, but also just completely random and were amazing. And just to give you one more example, we traveled from Pekong to Shan State, first to Inle, Nyangshui, and then to Daoji. And, a lot of tourists and a lot of people in Myanmar, Burma, they would go to Nyangshui and then go to Inle, right? But we did the other way around. We went up from Pekong to Inle to Nyangshui, which was absolutely beautiful, stunning. And we went to Daoji and we went there because we wanted to meet Auntie Hema, the daughter of Sao Shui Tai, the first president of post-independent Burma. And while we were waiting for her, we also knew that we wanted to speak to this gentleman in Daoji who was supposed to be very close to Bojo Aung San. But Auntie Hema was late. And then when she finally arrived, she told us, oh, I'm really, really sorry I'm late because I just attended the funeral of this gentleman that we wanted to meet. So we were heartbroken, but she was like, but you know what? There is another gentleman called Usa Aung who was the only official photographer during the Banlong conference. And she was like, he lives somewhere near Daoji Market. Go and find him. So we managed to go and find him, spoke to his daughter. He was very, very old already. And in fact, he passed away, I think 6 to 8 months after we met him. But she went to speak to her dad, who was like, yes, I want to talk to these journalists who wanted to know about my experiences. And his photos from Banlong Conference are currently in the British Library. And we actually went to London and saw the official black and white photos that he took of Banlong Conference. So we had such amazing experiences, some of which were planned and some of which were completely, accidental.
Mm-hmm. Since the 2021 coup, the Kaitials has provided fellowships to journalists, artists, creative professionals who have been targeted by the military. How have these stories changed?
Yeah, so like I was saying, in the past, what we were doing was talking to ordinary and extraordinary people about their life stories, right? And sometimes it's about their life and work, sometimes it's about culture, sometimes it's about food. But after the coup, we realized, at DVB, you yourself have experienced, right? How difficult life has become for a lot of journalists, particularly freelance journalists, because most newsrooms have been shuttered. Many of them either had to flee their homes or Myanmar because it became too dangerous, or if they were still in country, they had to be extremely, extremely careful. And of course, journalism was never a highly paid profession in Myanmar, but it had gotten so much worse since the coup. So we raised some funds and then started supporting journalists inside and outside the country, where they write anonymous diaries. And these are not reporting stories that you would imagine at a traditional news site. These are about what these journalists have gone through, what their families have gone through, what the people that they met have gone through. So these are tales of survival and resistance. And in some ways, these are also stories of resilience as well. Although I now hesitate to use the term resilience because people think that we as in, Burmese people or people from Myanmar are so resilient that they could just leave us alone and expect us to just survive on our own. But yeah, these are tales of, survival and resistance.
Has storytelling become a form of resistance?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, of course, it is not the same kind of resistance as picking up arms, but a lot of the times what dictatorships want, right, and what the military council wants is for us to stop talking about what is happening in Myanmar, for us to stop talking about how they are oppressing the people, how they're attacking their own people. So in that sense, just telling the stories of how people are surviving, what they're doing, what they are going through, is a form of resistance.
You've also become a sought-after commentator on Myanmar's post-coup crisis. How do you explain the situation to an international audiences?
Oh, it is a challenge, because I think you can very, very generally, you can say there are two different types of audiences when it comes to talking about Myanmar. There are people who have always been interested in Myanmar and invested in Myanmar and continues to do so. It's unfortunately quite a small group. Then you have another group who, for whatever reason, never really cared about Myanmar, or did care about Myanmar, but was really turned off by, all these stories about the atrocities committed against the Rohingya, or all the, discrimination against minority groups, whether it's Kachin or Chin or Shan or Rakhine or down south, who have sort of decided that they are no longer interested in Myanmar. And then depending on, the audience that I'm talking to, I try and shift how I talk about Myanmar. It's a lot easier for people who are already interested in it. I really want to capture the audience who either are not interested or have lost interest in Myanmar. And I try to, the way I try to tell them is, number one, by telling the stories about ordinary people, right? That's also why I think we do the kite tales and why I focus so much on people, because instead of talking about the generals or people that they can't relate to, if you talk about a mother, a father, a sister, a young journalist, somebody who's just trying to make the most of it, have a dignified life, I feel like that's where the empathy and connection comes from. And I also try and raise this issue around how what is happening in Myanmar is not isolated, that this creep of authoritarianism and dictatorship is something that the whole world is seeing, and that they can learn from Myanmar. And the way they can learn is obviously by seeing what the junta is doing, but also by supporting people who are opposing the junta. So, I try to appeal to their sense of fairness, human rights, democracy. It is still a big challenge, though. I'm still trying to find the best formula to capture that audience.
You've always been a strong advocate for press freedom. And how have you had to change your approach over the last 5 years as support for Myanmar media has declined?
I mean, independent journalism and press freedom is under assault globally, not just Myanmar, right? I think Myanmar is just perhaps in some ways the most acute example of what is happening. So specifically for Myanmar, we support journalists through the kite tails, we raise funds. It is very, very small compared to the needs, but it is something. I've also been trying to mentor Myanmar newsrooms, trying to help them understand what the international audience wants to read, and trying to link them up with international media outlets so that they get experience and exposure, as well as some funding from their stories being published by international outlets. At the same time, I also try and I know it is really, really hard, particularly for Myanmar newsrooms, when you are stuck in either across the border or inside the country, to think beyond the war and the conflict. But I try to make them think about things like climate change or food, the topics that I've been covering, but that are also in some ways quite universal and easier for the international media outlets and the community to grasp. And I try and advocate as much as possible for international donors to keep supporting Myanmar. It is, again, it's not easy because funding cuts are happening everywhere, and journalism is under attack globally. But I really, really think that international support for independent journalism in Myanmar is, compared to in terms of dollars and cents, it makes so much sense and creates so much rewards for what is, to me, a small investment.
So what happens to international independent journalism when donors and international partners move on?
Oh gosh, I mean, you know this at DVB as well, right? Like, independent journalism is one of the pillars of a democratic society, right? Because if the journalism is not independent, how is it different from propaganda? So when funding for independent journalism dwindles and it becomes harder and harder to do independent journalism, what you are getting is not the truth, right? What you're getting is it's propaganda. And we have seen over the past 5 years how determined Myanmar newsrooms are, right? Despite being banned, despite the internet shutdowns, the newsrooms, even after fleeing, they regrouped, they set it back up again, they kept it running. The locals are also hungry for news, and they find ways of accessing this news. But it has become extremely difficult to keep a lot of that going because, since the coup, almost every avenue of income generation that used to exist have completely disappeared. The only way for Myanmar newsrooms to survive has been either donations from international groups or from the readers. And we know how bad the economic situation is in Myanmar. We cannot expect people who are trying to survive to also prop up the newsrooms, right? So I do think Myanmar newsrooms will continue to exist, but it has just become incredibly challenging, and it is not going to be helpful to either Myanmar or the international community who wants to understand Myanmar for these, for this journalism to dwindle and disappear.
Yeah. So, you were invited to speak at the Oslo Freedom Forum on the theme of dismantling dictatorship. How did you explain Myanmar to that audience?
Well, I explained Myanmar to the audience as a country that has gone through this cycle of dictatorship to democracy and back again, right? And how this has happened, how, again, there was so much hope and optimism during that brief opening, and what has happened since. And I try to place what happened in Myanmar, together with what is happening, for example, in Gaza, in Ukraine, and even in the United States in terms of media freedom, about how governments around the world are almost, using the same playbook as the Myanmar junta so that they can relate to what is happening. I hope it was successful.
Did you share any practical tips on how to dismantle dictatorship in Myanmar?
Well, I said that if they're serious about dismantling dictatorships anywhere, not just Myanmar, that they should be supporting independent journalism. And, Myanmar had a thriving media ecosystem before the coup that has been devastated, and they now need to continue so that the media can keep, the military and others accountable.
How did the audience react when you talked about Myanmar's intensifying conflict and deteriorating humanitarian crisis since the 2021 military coup?
I think some of them were very surprised and shocked, partly because Myanmar has fallen off the headlines, and they didn't realize how bad things had become, right? I mean, it is understandable why Myanmar has fallen off the headlines compared to others, because, after the coup in Myanmar, we had the US withdrawal of Afghanistan, then Russia invaded Ukraine, and since then we've had Gaza, we've had, Sudan, we have lots of other conflicts that had taken, attention away, but also it is so difficult to enter Myanmar, right, and do proper reporting in the way that some are able to do. Also, it is so difficult for citizen journalists in Myanmar to do the kind of, videos that you see in Gaza because the internet is really unstable or non-existent. There's been a shutdown, but also it's just so dangerous for people to show their faces. So that, so a lot of people were not aware of how bad the humanitarian situation has become. But then there were others who, I was really, really heartened by the fact that there were many others as well who remained committed to Myanmar and hopefully were inspired by the speech to continue supporting Myanmar, particularly journalists.
What kind of Myanmar stories still break through internationally, and what kinds of stories are ignored?
I think, unfortunately, in Myanmar, we have been the victim of what Chimananda Ngozi Adichie used to call the danger of a single story, where the focus has always been on this, this sort of fight or battle between the generals and Aung San Suu Kyi. And of course, that is a very, very, important and big part of history, but that is not complete. And I think international stories are still, unfortunately, 20 years on, still focused on that. So if there are any news, so for example, we recently heard the junta talked about how, they've moved Aung San Suu Kyi to house arrest, that made headlines. There are questions as to whether that is true. And of course, there are a lot of concerns about, the health of Aung San Suu Kyi, and what's happened is obviously tragic. But there are also so many other things that is happening within Myanmar, by the democratic forces, the other institutions that are trying to, work within this terrible, terrible situation and what the ordinary people are going through. There's very, very, very little of that actually gets picked up by the international media, unless something very dramatic happened, like the earthquake. But even then, with the earthquake last year, you will notice that the first few days, most of the stories were from Thailand because of access. Right. So there's still, like, unless there's a major humanitarian disaster, unless there's a big massacre, unless the topic is about, Dosu, or perhaps something about Main Line, it just doesn't get through to the international audience. I really, really hope the international media can focus more on ordinary people, what's happening in Myanmar, in the same way that they could focus on Gaza and Ukraine. But I also think some of it may be that it could be really good for Myanmar journalists to also find ways to capture that international audience through, topics that might be slightly different, like food or, climate change or something else beyond just the conflict.
Mm-hmm. You've been living in Europe for years, and since 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a major focus there. Have you found a way that can link the war in Ukraine with the 2021 coup in Myanmar?
So it's been hard to link directly what's happening in Ukraine with the coup in Myanmar. But of course, in Europe, this is a massive issue and people have very strong feelings about it. And they see Russia as clearly the aggressor. So what I try to say is, oh, you see how Russia is behaving in Ukraine. Do you also know that they support the military dictatorship in Myanmar? And not just support in terms of words, right? It's like material support. They are essentially helping to prolong the life of the Myanmar junta. So that's how I, try and frame it. And also, I try to tell particularly, people in the United States, where at one point, some of the people in the Trump administration talked about election fraud and, and staging a coup and saying, look what happened in Myanmar. We had a democratic election and we had a clear winner. You can argue about the specific voting system or political system under which the elections are held, but it was free and fair. There was a winner. And then this is what the military has done. And look where we are now. A coup is an incredibly slippery slope for losing your rights. So that's how I've, tried to portray what has happened in Myanmar as a lesson for the rest of the world. And for that, and also why the rest of the world should care about and do something about Myanmar, because it could happen to them as well.
So before we wrap up, how can people find and follow your writing and the kite tales?
Well, you can find the diaries from our journalist fellows and illustrator fellows on our website in both Burmese and English. That's kite-tales.org. You can also find the old stories, where we interview Auntie Hema and Baba Uansan and Baba Usa Aun and all those people as well. I also have my little own newsletter called Thin Lei, where I usually share my thoughts on food systems and Myanmar. And you can also see some of our investigations that we're doing with Lighthouse Reports, some of which actually concerns Myanmar. So you can find that on that website as well.
And finally, is there anything you would like to say to people who are still paying attention to Myanmar?
I would like to first thank them for still, being interested in Myanmar, and just to say, please support, Myanmar and Myanmar journalists in any way you can. It doesn't have to be about money. It doesn't have to be about funding. It can be about just spreading the word and telling others about what is happening, because what the junta wants the world to do is to just forget about Myanmar and to let them do whatever they want with the country. We can't let that happen.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.